His presentation is on the massacre that occurred in Nanjing in 1937. This genocide was a mass murder which killed up to 300,000 people in the span of about 6 weeks. It occurred in the Chinese capital of Nanjing. My group presentation project is going to explain throughout the rest of the slides all of the events which contributed. It will overall explain many aspects of this event in history. The basis for it was the Second Sino-Japanese War and the invasion of Japan into Chinese territory. There were several contributing causes that led to this massacre of hundreds of thousands Chinese at the capital city of Nanjing. First, there is a factor of the Second Sino-Japanese War happening. This led to the Japanese invasion into China. As a part of that invasion, the Japanese desired to increase their influence over the Chinese. War crimes began as many Japanese army soldiers advanced. More atrocities like rape, stealing, and murdering were occurring. The Japanese developed a superiority belief that felt their role was to re-educate and reform the Chinese. As the Japanese advanced further in and took more of the locations with dominating war crime activities, they created the ability to overcome the Chinese people and ultimately participated in these mass murders. Before the massacre at Nanking, Japanese forces had just defeated Shanghai in the Sino-Japanese War. As Japanese forces were headed to Nanking, the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek was fearful to lose to these Japanese forces and ordered all of his Chinese troops out of Nanking, and this was a grave mistake. The Chinese troops left the city, leaving only untrained secondary troops and mostly all of the city's civilians. On December 1st, 1937, the Chinese government fled, only leaving a small refugee area for the remaining civilians, which was promised not to be touched by the Japanese Central China Front Army, which was on the way. December 13th marked the first entrance of the Japanese troops in Nanking, led by General Matsuani. This was the start of violence, death, destruction, and torture, and there was no end in sight. Remaining Chinese soldiers were brutally murdered. Families, even children and infants, were killed, and any single woman in the Japanese soldier site was horrifically raped and left to die, or murdered on the spot. Finally, after months and months of destruction and death, in February 1938, Japan had a puppet government that had taken control of Nanking, and the killing slowed to a stop. This appalling massacre had killed over 200,000 Chinese civilians and left upwards to 80,000 women brutally raped and mutilated. The impacts of the rape at Nanking were tremendous. At least 20,000 and upwards to 80,000 women, children, and elderly were horrifically raped, some mutilated with bayonets, bamboo, and swords, and left for dead. Not only were these people brutally raped, but the Japanese soldier made family members harm each other and watched for fun. Just horrific act after horrific act. After Japanese forces breached the Nanking safety zone, upwards to 200,000 civilians were murdered. Then they were either burned, thrown into the local Yangtze River, or just stacked on top of each other in mass graves. About 1,400 Chinese soldiers were found and taken as prisoners of war. These prisoners of war were dreadfully murdered, whether it was being set on fire, gunned down by the river, or blown up with landmines. About a third of the city of Nanking was burned to the ground, mostly government buildings and family homes. The rest of the city was looted, stolen, and nearly destroyed. The Japanese have had a hard time taking accountability for their actions in the rape of Nanking. Japanese nationalists made moves to say that famous historian Irish Chang was only spreading lies and misinformation about the country. Professor Nobukasu Fujioka even tried to prevent her book, Rape of Nanking, from being published in Japan. The campaign for recognition and reparations of the event began in 1997 after Chang's book was published, and people began to see what truly took place. The Japanese Prime Minister, Junichiro Koizumi, gave an apology in about 2005 for the way Japanese treated China in World War II. Up until that point, the only other justice received by the victims of Nanking were the executions of the wartime criminals General Iwan Matsui and his lieutenant Tiani Hiseo after World War II. China and Japan have had a long, strained relationship, though China held much influence over Japan. Japan adopted much of their culture and language. Despite that, China attacked 2 times, once in 1274 and again in 1281. However, the Mongol forces were driven out and destroyed by the typhoons. Their failed mission soon became coined as kamikaze. Then again in 1592, Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched an invasion into Korea to travel upwards to conquer China. Then again in 1597, Japan invaded Korea for a second time. Their attempt resulted in failure when Hideyoshi passed away during war. In 1937, within just 6 weeks, the Imperial Japanese Army murdered hundreds of thousands of people, those including soldiers and innocent civilians. They raped between 20 to 80,000 women while leaving the capital of China destroyed, taking years to rebuild. Killing competitions were used by Japanese commanders as motivations. Winners were praised by news reporters, and there are street riots at the end of December, which included soldiers on every corner forcing everyone to stay inside. This was an example of the Japanese culture around war and crime in 1937. Foreigners played a major role in helping Chinese people who were impacted by the rape of Nanjing in many ways. They created a group of foreigners that had lived in Nanjing that wanted to help save the lives of these Chinese civilians. They created safe zones called the Nanjing Safe Zone, which was about 4 square miles located in western Nanjing. At these land sites, they would provide food, water, shelter, and medical care, and much more for the refugees who were gravely in need. An international committee was created by the foreigners for the Nanjing Safety Zone, which were 7 Americans, 1 Danish person, 3 German people, and 4 British people.